Everyone feared the billionaire's fiancée, until one brave maid stood up to her. "Hey, stop scrolling for a second." Everyone inside that mansion followed one unspoken rule: never cross the billionaire's fiancé. The maids lowered their eyes when she walked past. The butlers rehearsed her coffee order like it was a matter of survival. Even the billionaire himself, a man who controlled a fortune worth billions, seemed to soften and shrink whenever she raised her voice. Nobody had ever dared to stand up to her. Nobody ever would. That's what everyone believed. They were completely wrong. What happened at that dinner table didn't just shock a room full of wealthy guests, it changed four lives forever. And by the time this story ends, it might just change the way you see people too. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop your country in the comments. I really do love reading where you all tune in from. Today's story is about pride, quiet cruelty, and a kind of courage that money can never buy. Stay with me all the way to the end, because this one gets far more emotional than you'd expect. Nobody in Boston believed a maid could ever change the course of a billionaire's life. The Cole mansion sat on 11 acres of manicured lawn overlooking the harbor, a house so large that even the staff who had worked there for years still got lost in its hallways. Marble floors stretched endlessly beneath crystal chandeliers, and every room smelled faintly of fresh flowers, flown in twice a week from a florist in New York. This was the world Grace Williams walked into every morning at 6 o'clock sharp, wearing a red uniform with a white collar and a name tag that read Williams pinned just above her heart. Grace was 32 years old, and she had been working at the Cole estate for almost 3 years. She wasn't the kind of woman people noticed right away. She kept her head down, did her work quietly, and never complained, even when the job asked more of her than it paid her for. But if you looked closely, you'd see something steady in her eyes, the kind of steadiness that comes from a woman who has carried more weight than anyone around her realized. She was raising her 8-year-old daughter, Emma, alone. Her husband had passed away 4 years earlier in a car accident, leaving Grace with a mortgage, a car that broke down more often than it ran, and a little girl who still asked, some nights, if Daddy was coming home soon. The job at the Cole mansion paid better than anything else Grace could find without a college degree, and so she showed up every single day, rain or shine, grateful for work most people would consider beneath them. Nathan Cole, the man who owned the mansion, was 34 years old and had inherited one of the largest real estate empires on the East Coast from his father. He was tall, disciplined, and almost always working, flying between cities, closing deals, rarely home before 9 at night. People who met him assumed he was cold, but the staff who actually worked in his house knew better. Nathan was quiet, polite to a fault, and strangely humble for a man worth billions. He always said thank you to the maids. He remembered their names. He tipped the delivery drivers more than necessary and never let anyone see him do it. But Nathan had one blind spot the size of the ocean: Vanessa Hale. Vanessa was 33, stunning in the kind of way that made rooms go quiet when she entered them, and engaged to Nathan after a whirlwind 8-month romance that had swept through Boston's social pages. In public, she was radiant, laughing at Nathan's jokes, resting her head on his shoulder at charity galas, telling reporters how grounded and real he made her feel despite his wealth. Everyone who saw them together assumed it was a fairy tale. The staff knew a different Vanessa. Behind closed doors, when Nathan was traveling or locked away in his office, Vanessa's voice changed. It grew sharp, clipped, impatient. She snapped her fingers at maids to refill her wine. She left towels on the floor for someone else to pick up, as if bending down were beneath her. She once made a young housekeeper cry after accusing her, without proof, of stealing a bracelet that later turned up in Vanessa's own jewelry box. No one ever reported it. Everyone was too afraid. Grace had learned, in her 3 years there, to simply survive Vanessa's moods. She kept her answers short. Yes, Right away, I'm sorry, She swallowed her pride the way you swallow bitter medicine, not because it tasted good, but because Emma needed new shoes for school and the mortgage was due on the 15th, and there was no version of this story where Grace could afford to lose this job over her feelings. Still, there were nights Grace sat in her car in the mansion's staff parking lot, gripping the steering wheel, breathing slowly before she allowed herself to cry. Not because the work was hard, she didn't mind hard work, but because of the way Vanessa looked at her sometimes, like she wasn't a person at all. Like she was furniture that happened to move. "You're stronger than she is," Grace's mother used to tell her over the phone. "Women like that only have power because people let them have it." Grace wanted to believe that. But belief and reality were two very different things when you were the one standing in that dining room, holding a tray, praying you didn't spill anything. The night of the engagement dinner was supposed to be simple. Nathan had invited close family and a handful of business partners to celebrate the upcoming wedding. An intimate gathering, 20 guests at most, seated around the long mahogany table in the East Wing. Grace had been assigned to serve the main course, a task she'd done 100 times before without incident. She had no idea that in less than an hour, everything in that house was about to change. As she carried the final tray of wine glasses through the kitchen doors, she caught a glimpse of Vanessa laughing at something Nathan's grandmother said, her diamond necklace catching the chandelier light, her smile wide and warm for the cameras that weren't even there. Grace exhaled, steadied the tray, and pushed open the door. She had no way of knowing that within the hour, she would be the only person in that entire room brave enough to say no. Nobody imagined the quietest woman in the house would be the one to break the silence first. 3 weeks before the engagement dinner, Grace had discovered something she wished she hadn't. She'd been assigned to tidy Vanessa's private suite while Vanessa was out at a spa appointment, a routine task involving fresh linens and dusting the bookshelves. While straightening a stack of papers on the writing desk near the window, Grace's eyes caught a name that wasn't Vanessa's. A name on what looked like a legal letter, folded neatly beneath a magazine. Grace wasn't the type to snoop. She respected privacy, especially in a house where people's secrets paid her salary. But the letterhead belonged to a law firm, and one line, visible before she quickly covered it back up, read, "Regarding the dissolution of prior marital assets." Marital. Prior marriage. Vanessa had told Nathan, told the papers, told everyone at every gala, that she had never been married. That Nathan was her first real love. Grace didn't finish reading the letter. She refolded it exactly as she'd found it, placed the magazine back on top, and left the room with her heart pounding harder than it had any right to. She told no one. Not because she didn't care, but because she understood something painful about her position in that house. Nobody would believe a maid's word over a socialite's smile. If she said anything, she'd be fired within the hour, branded a liar or a jealous gossip, and Emma would be the one who suffered for it. So Grace buried it. She went back to work the next morning as if she'd seen nothing. But burying something doesn't make it disappear. It just waits. In the weeks that followed, Grace watched Vanessa more closely than she meant to. She noticed the way Vanessa's charm switched on and off like a light, warm and glowing whenever Nathan or his family were in the room, ice cold the second they left. She noticed how Vanessa referred to the household staff as the help, never by name, despite living in that house for over a year. She noticed how Vanessa once complained to a friend, in a voice she clearly thought was private, that marrying Nathan was a lot of work for the payoff, and laughed like it was nothing. Grace wasn't the only one paying attention. Eleanor Cole, Nathan's 81-year-old grandmother, had lived in that house her entire adult life and had outlasted 3 decades of housekeepers, drivers, and dinner guests. She missed very little. She had noticed, months earlier, that Vanessa never once asked her a genuine question about her life, her late husband, or the family history hanging in portraits along the staircase. Vanessa only ever asked about the estate's value, the wedding budget, and whether the Cole name still meant something in certain circles. Eleanor said nothing to Nathan. Not yet. She had learned, over 81 years, that some truths need to reveal themselves before people are ready to hear them from someone else's mouth. Nathan, meanwhile, remained blissfully unaware of all of it. He was a man who built his empire on spreadsheets and deadlines, brilliant with numbers but strangely illiterate when it came to reading people, especially the one person closest to him. Vanessa had entered his life during the hardest year of his career, right after his father's death, when Nathan was drowning in grief and responsibility. She had shown up with warmth, laughter, and an ease that made the crushing weight on his shoulders feel lighter. He mistook relief for love. Somewhere in the exhaustion of running a company and burying his father, he'd stopped asking hard questions. He didn't see Vanessa snap at the housekeeping staff because he was never in the room when it happened. He didn't see Grace flinch when Vanessa raised her voice because Grace made sure he never did. She absorbed it, swallowed it, protected the piece of a house that had already given her so much just by employing her. The morning of the engagement dinner, Vanessa was unusually tense. She'd overheard Nathan on the phone with his lawyer, discussing something about updated prenuptial terms ahead of the wedding, a routine legal formality that meant nothing sinister on its own. But to a woman with a hidden letter in her drawer, it sounded like suspicion. It sounded like someone getting close to the truth. By the time evening arrived and guests began filling the dining room, Vanessa's charm was stretched thin over something brittle underneath. She smiled for photos. She laughed at the right moments. But her eyes kept drifting toward the kitchen doors, toward the staff moving quietly in and out, as if daring one of them to say the wrong thing at the wrong time. Grace had no idea any of this was happening beneath the surface. She only knew she had a tray of wine glasses to deliver and a room full of important people waiting. She pushed open the kitchen door, balancing the tray carefully, and stepped into the dining room just as Nathan stood to make a toast. "To Vanessa," he said, raising his glass, his voice full of a happiness Grace had rarely heard from him. "The woman who saved me from myself." Grace lowered her eyes and kept walking toward the table, unaware that in the next 10 minutes, everything Nathan believed about the woman standing beside him was about to be tested in front of every person he loved. Nobody in that room expected a maid's hand to be the one that finally stopped Vanessa Hale. The toast finished, glasses clinked, and the room settled into the easy chatter of a dinner party in full swing. Grace moved between guests with practiced grace, refilling wine, clearing small plates, staying invisible in the way good service staff learn to become. She had almost made it through the meal without incident. Then came dessert. Vanessa had specifically requested a chocolate soufflé, delicate and difficult, the kind of dish that collapses if handled a second too roughly. Grace carried it out on a silver tray, careful with every step across the polished floor. As she leaned in to set it in front of Vanessa, her sleeve brushed the edge of a nearly empty wine glass beside the plate. It wobbled, tipped, and a small splash of red wine landed on the white tablecloth. Nowhere near Vanessa's dress, nowhere near any guest, just a few drops on the linen. The room barely registered it. Conversations continued. Nathan didn't even look up from his conversation with a business partner. But Vanessa's face changed instantly. She stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor, silencing the table. "Are you serious right now?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the warm chatter like a blade. "Do you have any idea what this tablecloth cost? Do you have any idea what tonight even means?" "I'm so sorry," Grace said quietly, already reaching for a napkin. "I'll clean it right." "You'll clean it right now, and then you'll explain to me why I keep dealing with the same clumsy mistakes from you people." The word landed like a slap all on its own. You people. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nathan's smile faded, confusion crossing his face, though he still hadn't fully grasped what was happening. Grace kept her eyes down, her hands trembling slightly as she blotted the small stain. "It won't happen again." "You're right, it won't," Vanessa said. "Because you're done. I'm not doing this anymore. I've had enough of the incompetence in this house." And then, faster than anyone could react, Vanessa's hand shot up. It wasn't a slow, deliberate motion. It was sharp, sudden, fueled by something that had clearly been building for far longer than one spilled drop of wine. Months of swallowed frustration, buried secrets, and the pressure of a lie she was terrified might unravel. Her palm rose toward Grace's face. Every person at that table froze. Nathan half rose from his seat, too far away to stop it. Eleanor gasped audibly. The other guests recoiled, hands flying to their mouths. And then, in a single motion that would replay in everyone's memory for years afterward, Grace's hand shot up and caught Vanessa's wrist mid-air, inches from her own cheek. The room went completely silent. Grace didn't yell. She didn't cry. She simply held Vanessa's wrist steady, her grip firm but not violent, and looked her directly in the eyes for the first time in 3 years of forced deference. "No," Grace said, her voice calm but unmistakably clear. "You don't get to do that. Not to me. Not to anyone." Vanessa's face twisted with disbelief, her mouth opening and closing without words for what felt like an eternity. Nobody in that house had ever refused her. Nobody had ever dared. "Let go of me," Vanessa hissed, yanking her arm back the moment Grace released her grip. "I've cleaned up plenty of things I didn't make in this house," Grace said quietly, setting down the napkin with a steadiness that surprised even her. "But I won't clean up being treated like I'm nothing. Not tonight. Not ever again." The dining room remained frozen, 20 pairs of eyes darting between the two women, waiting to see what would happen next. Nathan finally found his footing and stepped around the table, his face pale with something between shock and dawning realization. "Vanessa," he said slowly. What was that?" She spilled wine on a $2,000 tablecloth. "Nathan, that's what that was," Vanessa said, straightening her dress, trying desperately to regain control of the room. "This is exactly why staff needs boundaries." "You tried to hit her," Nathan said, his voice low, disbelieving. "In front of my grandmother. In front of everyone." "I wasn't going to actually," Vanessa started, then stopped, realizing there was no version of that sentence that made her sound innocent. Eleanor Cole, silent until now, set down her wine glass with a deliberate click against the table. "In 81 years in this house," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had seen every kind of person pass through it, "I have never once seen anyone raise a hand to staff at this table. Not my husband. Not my son. Never." Vanessa's composure cracked further, her eyes darting toward Nathan, searching for the rescue she was used to receiving. "It didn't come." "Grace," Nathan said, turning toward her, his voice suddenly gentle, almost pleading, "Are you all right?" Grace nodded once, picked up her tray with hands that had finally stopped trembling, and said the only thing she could manage. "I'm fine, sir. I'll go check on the kitchen." She turned and walked away, leaving behind a room full of shocked guests, a furious fiancé, and a billionaire staring at the woman he was about to marry as if seeing her clearly for the very first time. Nobody expected the real story to come out through a locked drawer and a folded letter. The dinner party ended early, guests ushered out with tight, awkward goodbyes, the celebratory mood of the evening replaced by a tension that clung to the air long after the last car pulled out of the driveway. Nathan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study until nearly 3 in the morning, replaying the moment Vanessa's hand had risen toward Grace's face, unable to shake the image no matter how many times he told himself it must have been a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding. He knew that. He'd seen it with his own eyes. The next morning, before most of the staff had arrived, Nathan found Grace in the small break room near the kitchen, tying her apron, preparing for another shift as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. He knocked softly on the open door. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. Grace straightened, surprised to see him there so early. "Of course, sir." "I need to apologize to you," Nathan said, and the words seemed to cost him something, like he wasn't used to saying them. "What happened last night should never have happened, and I should have stepped in faster. I'm sorry." Grace studied him for a moment, weighing whether this was genuine or simply damage control before guests started talking. "Thank you for saying that," she said carefully. "But I'm not the one you need to worry about, sir. I'll be all right." "Has this happened before?" Nathan asked. "The way she spoke to you. Has she done anything like that before?" Grace hesitated. 3 years of careful silence didn't disappear in one conversation. But something about the rawness in Nathan's voice, the genuine confusion of a man realizing he'd been blind in his own house, made her decide the truth mattered more than her fear. "She's not kind to the staff, sir," Grace said quietly. "Not when you're not around. It's not just me. Ask anyone who's worked here longer than a year." Nathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I never said anything," Grace continued, "because I need this job. I have a daughter. I can't afford to lose steady work over hurt feelings. So we got used to it. We learned to survive it." Nathan sat down slowly across from her, the weight of the last 12 hours pressing on him harder than any business deal ever had. "I had no idea," he said. "I really had no idea." There was a long pause before Grace spoke again, quieter this time. "There's something else, sir. I wasn't going to say anything, because it's not my place. But after last night, I think you deserve to know." She told him, carefully and without exaggeration, about the letter she'd seen weeks earlier on Vanessa's desk, the law firm letterhead, the phrase about dissolution of prior marital assets. She made it clear she hadn't read further, hadn't gone looking for it, had simply seen it by accident while cleaning. Nathan's face went pale. "She told me she'd never been married." "I don't know the full story," Grace said. "I only saw what I saw. I should have told someone sooner, but I was scared. I'm still scared, honestly, telling you now." Nathan sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the worn tabletop between them. When he finally looked up, his expression had hardened into something Grace hadn't seen from him before, not anger exactly, but the quiet, focused resolve of a man who had just realized how much he didn't know about his own life. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I mean that." Grace nodded, unsure what else to say, and returned to her morning routine, hoping the conversation might finally bring some kind of accountability into that house. She had no idea Vanessa was listening from the hallway. Vanessa had woken early, still furious from the humiliation of the night before, determined to salvage her position before Nathan's family could turn him against her. She'd walked toward the kitchen intending to smooth things over with Nathan directly, only to freeze outside the break room door at the sound of her own secret being spoken aloud in Grace's careful, steady voice. Her stomach dropped. Her carefully built world, 3 years in the making, was cracking open in front of her. She didn't wait to hear Nathan's reaction. She turned sharply and marched toward the estate's management office instead, where she still held enough influence, as the future lady of the house, to make one final move before anyone could stop her. By noon, Grace received a call from the estate staffing coordinator, her voice apologetic but firm. "Grace, I'm so sorry to tell you this over the phone, but effective immediately, your position here has been terminated. Ms. Hale says it's due to conduct issues from last night's incident." Grace stood frozen in her kitchen at home, the phone pressed to her ear, Emma's backpack still hanging on the chair from that morning school drop-off. "I understand," she said quietly, though nothing about it felt understandable at all. She hung up the phone, sat down at her small kitchen table, and allowed herself, for the first time in months, to cry without holding anything back. Not because she regretted standing up for herself, but because standing up for herself had just cost her everything she needed to keep her daughter safe. She had no way of knowing that across town, in a mansion overlooking the harbor, Nathan Cole was about to discover exactly what his fiancée had done, and it would be the beginning of the end for Vanessa Hale. Nobody warned Grace that losing her job would feel heavier than losing almost everything else she'd survived. The days after her termination blurred together in a haze of quiet panic. Grace sat at her kitchen table each morning with a legal pad, calculating how many weeks her savings would cover the mortgage, how many more times she could stretch a grocery budget that was already stretched thin. Emma, sensing something was wrong even without understanding the details, had taken to hugging her mother a little longer at bedtime, asking softly, "Are you sad, Mommy?" "I'm okay, baby," Grace would answer, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Everything's going to be fine." She applied for cleaning positions at hotels, offices, anywhere within driving distance. Most places wanted references from her most recent employer, and Grace found herself in the impossible position of explaining, over and over, that she'd been let go after conduct incident she couldn't fully describe without sounding either dramatic or dishonest. 2 interviews ended abruptly the moment she mentioned it. She didn't blame the interviewers. She barely understood how to explain it herself. She never once, in all those difficult conversations, mentioned Vanessa's name publicly or tried to turn the story in her own favor. It would have been easy to paint herself as a victim, to let sympathy carry her further than the truth might. But Grace had been raised by a mother who always said that dignity wasn't about being seen as right, it was about being right when no one was watching. So she kept her head down and kept searching, one rejection at a time. Back at the coal estate, the atmosphere had shifted into something brittle and strange. The remaining staff whispered in corners, careful never to be overheard, but everyone knew what had happened. Grace had been the longest-serving maid in the house, well-liked, dependable, the kind of quiet presence that made a large, cold mansion feel slightly less empty. Her sudden absence left a hole that no replacement seemed to fill properly. Eleanor Cole noticed it first. She noticed the new housekeeper who didn't know that Eleanor preferred her afternoon tea steeped for exactly 4 minutes, not 5. She noticed the empty spot at the small round table in the staff kitchen where Grace used to eat her lunch break, always 10 minutes early because she liked the quiet before the rest of the shift crowded in. She also noticed Nathan. Her grandson had grown distant and distracted in the days since the dinner party, staying later at the office than usual, coming home only to sit alone in his study with a glass of untouched scotch. Eleanor had lived long enough to recognize the particular silence of a man wrestling with a decision he didn't want to make but knew he couldn't avoid. One evening, she found him exactly where she expected. Behind his desk, staring at his laptop screen without typing anything, the same page open for what looked like an hour. "You're not working," Eleanor said, settling into the armchair across from him without waiting for an invitation. "You're thinking. Which, knowing you, is far more dangerous." Nathan managed a tired half-smile. "I fired Grace's replacement today. 3rd one this week. None of them last more than 2 days. That's not what's keeping you up at night, and we both know it," Eleanor said gently. Nathan closed the laptop slowly. "I've been looking into some things," he admitted. "Vanessa's background. Her family. Things she's told me over the past year that I never had reason to question." He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "Some of it doesn't add up, Grandma. Not even close." "Tell me," Eleanor said simply. Nathan hesitated, then began. The letter Grace had mentioned, the discreet inquiries he'd started making through his lawyer, the small inconsistencies he'd never bothered to notice before because he'd never had a reason to look. A previous engagement Vanessa claimed had just fizzled out that Nathan was now discovering had ended with a lawsuit over shared property. A wealthy family background that grew vaguer and more contradictory every time he mentioned it to people who supposedly knew her from before. "I let myself stop asking questions," Nathan admitted quietly. "After Dad died, everything hurt so much, and she made it hurt less. I think I decided that was enough. I didn't want to look too closely in case I found something that ruined it." Eleanor reached over and placed her hand over his. "Your grandfather used to say that the truth doesn't disappear just because you stop looking for it. It just waits patiently until you're ready to face it." "I fired an innocent woman for defending herself," Nathan said, his voice cracking slightly. "A woman who kept a secret that could have hurt Vanessa badly, and instead of using it, she just carried it quietly. For weeks. Out of decency. And I let Vanessa fire her the very next morning." "Then you know what you need to do," Eleanor said. "Find her," Nathan said, more to himself than to his grandmother. "And fix this. All of it." Eleanor smiled faintly, the first genuine smile Nathan had seen on her face in days. "That," she said, "sounds like the grandson I raised." Nobody expected the truth to unravel as quickly as it did once someone finally started pulling the right threads. Nathan spent the following week doing something he had never done in his adult life. Quietly, methodically investigating the person he was supposed to marry. He hired a discreet private investigator, a woman named Carla Reyes, who had built her career on exactly this kind of delicate, high-stakes work for wealthy families who needed answers without headlines. What Carla uncovered within days painted a picture far darker than Nathan had prepared himself for. Vanessa Hale's engagement to Nathan wasn't her first brush with wealth. 5 years earlier, she had been engaged to a technology executive in Chicago, a relationship that ended not in heartbreak but in a messy legal settlement after Vanessa allegedly convinced her fiancé to co-sign significant loans in her name, loans she never repaid before the relationship abruptly ended. Before that, a shorter relationship with an aging real estate investor in Florida had ended with Vanessa receiving a gift of nearly $200,000 just months before he passed away, a gift his adult children had quietly disputed in court, though the case never reached the public eye. There was no dramatic criminal record, no headline-grabbing scandal. Just a pattern, careful and deliberate, of a woman who moved from wealthy man to wealthy man, extracting what she could before circumstances forced her to move on. Nathan sat in his study reading through Carla's report late into the night, each page landing like a small, cold stone in his stomach. He thought about the wedding invitations already sent out. He thought about the ring on Vanessa's finger, chosen from his late mother's jewelry collection. He thought about how close he had come to marrying someone who saw him, ultimately, as nothing more than the next name on a list. He also thought, more than once, about Grace, a woman with far less money, far less power, and far more integrity than the woman he'd nearly promised his life to. The next morning, Nathan asked his assistant to track down Grace's contact information from old employment records. It took less than an hour to find her address, though Nathan sat outside the small house for almost 10 minutes before working up the nerve to knock. Grace opened the door in old jeans and a faded t-shirt, clearly in the middle of scrubbing floors for a cleaning service she'd finally managed to get hired by, one that paid nearly half of what the Cole estate had. Her surprise at seeing Nathan standing on her porch was immediate and obvious. "Mr. Cole," she said carefully, "is something wrong?" "I owe you an apology," Nathan said, standing awkwardly on the small porch, feeling entirely out of place away from the polished world he was used to. "A real one. Not the kind I gave you in the break room." Grace crossed her arms, wary but listening. "I let Vanessa fire you the morning after you told me the truth," Nathan continued. "I should have stopped it. I should have protected you the moment she raised her hand at that table, not the next morning after the damage was already done." "You don't owe me anything, sir," Grace said quietly, though her voice wavered slightly. "I did what I thought was right. That was my choice." "It cost you your job," Nathan said. "Your income. Your stability. And you did it anyway, even when it would have been so much easier to just stay quiet like everyone else in that house has learned to do." Grace was quiet for a long moment, studying the man standing on her porch, so different from the confident, distracted billionaire she remembered serving dinner to for 3 years. "What made you come here?" she finally asked. "The truth," Nathan said simply. "About Vanessa. About everything. You were right to be careful with what you found. If I'd known what she was capable of sooner, I might have avoided a lot of pain, for both of us." Grace felt something in her chest loosen slightly, though the ache of the past 2 weeks hadn't fully disappeared. "I'm not looking for revenge, Mr. Cole," she said. "I just wanted to keep my dignity. That's all I've ever wanted." "I know," Nathan said. "That's exactly why I'm here." Nobody in that quiet neighborhood expected a billionaire's car to be parked outside a modest house for nearly an hour, but there Nathan stayed, sitting on Grace's porch steps, laying out everything Carla Reyes had uncovered. The pattern of relationships, the settlements, the small fortune Vanessa had quietly accumulated from men who had trusted her completely. Grace listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from cautious surprise to a kind of tired sadness. "I'm sorry," she said when he finished. "Not because I liked her. But because none of that should have happened to you either." "You could have used what you found against her," Nathan said. "You could have threatened to expose her unless she paid you off, or unless she treated you better. A lot of people would have. Instead, you carried it quietly and got fired for standing up for yourself in a completely unrelated moment. I'm not a lot of people, Grace said simply. Nathan studied her for a long moment. No, he agreed. You're really not. He offered her, right there on the porch, her old position back, not as a favor, not as charity, but as an overdue correction. He also offered something more, a permanent position as head of household staff, with a salary that would finally give her real breathing room, real stability for Emma's future. Grace hesitated. Pride and practicality warred visibly on her face. I don't want this because you feel guilty, she said carefully. I need you to understand that. It's not guilt, Nathan said. It's respect. You showed more integrity in that dining room than anyone else in my life has shown me in years, including the woman I almost married. I'd be a fool not to want someone like that working somewhere I could actually see it. Grace finally allowed herself a small, genuine smile, the first one in weeks. I'll think about it, she said. But thank you. Really. Meanwhile, back at the estate, Vanessa had grown increasingly paranoid. She'd noticed Nathan's sudden distance, the late nights, the way he no longer discussed wedding details with the enthusiasm he once had. When she overheard a member of the household staff mention, in passing, that Nathan had hired an investigator for background verification purposes, her carefully maintained calm cracked entirely. She made a decision that would prove to be her final mistake. Rather than waiting to see what Nathan already knew, she tried to get ahead of the story by contacting a local gossip columnist herself, hoping to plant a sympathetic narrative before any damaging information could surface, painting herself as a woman being unfairly investigated by a paranoid, controlling billionaire fiancé. It backfired instantly. The columnist, sensing a bigger story, began making calls of her own, eventually reaching out to Nathan's publicist for comment. Within 48 hours, quiet whispers about Vanessa's past relationships began circulating in exactly the social circles she'd spent years trying to impress. Nathan learned about the leaked story from his lawyer, along with a tip that Vanessa herself had likely started it. It was, in some strange way, the final piece of clarity he needed. A woman confident in her own innocence doesn't scramble to control the narrative before the truth even comes out. He called Vanessa that evening and asked her to meet him at the estate the following day, not for another engagement dinner, but for a conversation he no longer intended to delay. Nobody at the Cole estate had ever seen Nathan look so calm while doing something so difficult. The meeting was set for the following afternoon in the same dining room where everything had unraveled 2 weeks earlier. Nathan requested that Eleanor be present, along with his family lawyer, and, to Vanessa's visible surprise when she walked in and saw her, Grace as well, standing quietly near the doorway, dressed not in her old uniform but in her own clothes, present at Nathan's specific invitation. "What is this?" Vanessa asked, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Some kind of intervention." "It's a conversation," Nathan said evenly, gesturing for her to sit. "One that's long overdue." He laid it out clearly and without cruelty, not shouting, not seeking to humiliate her, simply stating the facts Carla Reyes had uncovered, one by one. The previous engagement in Chicago. The disputed gift in Florida. The pattern that connected them. He didn't raise his voice once, which somehow made it land harder than anger would have. Vanessa's composure cracked slowly at first, then all at once. "You don't understand what it's like," she said, her voice rising, "growing up with nothing and watching everyone around you get everything just because they were born into it. I did what I had to do to survive." "There's a difference between surviving and taking advantage of people who trusted you," Nathan said quietly. "I would have helped you if you'd ever been honest with me about where you came from. Instead, you built an entire relationship on lies, and when a woman with far less power than you showed more honesty in one moment than you have in the entire time I've known you, you had her fired out of pride." Vanessa's eyes flicked toward Grace, standing silently by the door, and something ugly flashed across her face before she caught herself. "This is about her," she said. "This was always about her, wasn't it?" The maid. This is about you, Nathan corrected calmly. Grace didn't do anything except refuse to be hit and quietly protect a secret she could have used against you. You did everything else yourself. The engagement ended that afternoon, quietly and without further scenes, though word inevitably spread through Boston's social circles within days. Vanessa left the estate that same evening, and though the gossip columns had their moment with the story, Nathan refused every request for comment, unwilling to turn Grace's dignity or his own mistakes into public entertainment. In the days that followed, something shifted in the Cole household. Nathan began personally learning the names of every staff member who worked in his home, something he realized, with quiet shame, he'd never fully done before. He established a formal policy: no more informal dismissals, no more decisions made in anger, every staff concern to be brought directly to him or to Eleanor. Grace, after several days of careful consideration, accepted the position Nathan offered her, head of household staff, with a salary that finally allowed her to move Emma into a better school district and put away real savings for the first time since her husband's passing. On her first morning back, Grace stood once again in the same kitchen doorway where everything had happened, tying her apron with hands that felt steadier than they had in years. Eleanor found her there, smiling warmly. "Welcome home," Eleanor said simply. Grace smiled back, feeling something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for far too long. "Thank you for believing me," she said. "I didn't just believe you," Eleanor said. "I watched you. There's a difference." Nobody expected the final confrontation to happen not in the Cole mansion, but at a charity gala 3 months later, in front of the very same Boston elite who had once watched Vanessa float effortlessly through every room. Nathan had been hesitant to attend, still cautious about public appearances after the quiet scandal of his broken engagement, but the gala benefited a children's hospital his late mother had championed for years, and he felt obligated to show up. What he didn't expect was Vanessa's presence there as well, invited by mutual acquaintances who hadn't yet heard the full story, still trying to rebuild her social standing one carefully chosen event at a time. The moment came unexpectedly, in the middle of the cocktail hour, when Vanessa approached Nathan directly, apparently hoping for a public reconciliation that would repair her damaged reputation in front of witnesses. "Nathan," she said smoothly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "I think we both said things we regret. I'd love the chance to explain everything properly, without lawyers and investigators involved." Nathan, flanked by Eleanor and, coincidentally, standing near Grace, who had attended as part of coordinating the evening's catering arrangements for the estate's charitable contribution, remained composed. "There's nothing to explain, Vanessa," he said calmly. "I know what happened. I know who you are. I'm not interested in rewriting that story for an audience." Vanessa's eyes flicked toward Grace, standing quietly nearby in a simple dark dress, clearly still uncomfortable being anywhere near this confrontation. "Of course she's here," Vanessa said, her voice sharpening despite her attempt at composure. "I should have known you'd replace me with the help the moment I was gone." A few nearby guests turned at the comment, drawn by the sudden edge in her voice. "Grace works for my family," Nathan said evenly, "and she's earned every bit of respect she gets, which is more than I can say for how you treated people who couldn't fight back. You raised your hand to her in my own dining room, Vanessa. In front of my grandmother. That's not something I'm ever going to forget, or excuse, no matter how this conversation goes tonight." The room around them had gone noticeably quiet, several guests now openly listening, phones discreetly lowered but not entirely put away. Vanessa, cornered and humiliated in the exact circle she'd spent years trying to impress, made one final mistake. "You have no idea what it's like to claw your way into rooms like this," she hissed, "while people like her get everything handed to them just for being polite and patient. That's not strength. That's just knowing your place." "That," Eleanor said, stepping forward with the quiet authority of a woman who had earned every grey hair on her head, "is exactly the problem, dear. Grace never once thought she needed to know her place. She simply refused to let anyone else define it for her. That's not weakness. That's the kind of strength people like you will never understand, no matter how many rooms you claw your way into. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, found nothing left to say, and instead turned sharply on her heel, disappearing into the crowd amid a wave of hushed, knowing whispers that would follow her through Boston society for a long time to come. Grace, silent throughout the entire exchange, finally spoke once Vanessa was gone. "I didn't want this to happen here," she said quietly. "Not like this, in front of everyone." "You didn't do anything," Nathan said gently. "She did this to herself, months ago, the moment she decided cruelty was an acceptable way to get what she wanted." Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. "The truth has a way of finding its moment," she said. Tonight was simply hers. Nobody who watched Grace Williams push a cleaning cart down that hallway 3 years earlier could have imagined where her story would eventually lead. A year passed quietly after the gala, and the Cole estate slowly transformed into something neither Nathan nor his late father had ever quite managed to build, a household run not on fear or hierarchy, but on genuine respect. Grace, now firmly established as head of household staff, had reshaped the culture of the entire estate simply by insisting that every person who worked there, from the newest housekeeper to the longest-serving groundskeeper, be treated with the same basic dignity she had once been denied. Emma, now 9 years old, had settled happily into her new school, thriving in a stability her mother had fought so hard to provide. Grace still drove the same car, still lived in the same modest house, still carried the quiet, careful habits of a woman who had once counted every dollar before spending it. Money hadn't changed who she was. It had simply given her room to breathe. Nathan, for his part, had become a quieter, more thoughtful version of the man he used to be. He spent less time buried in spreadsheets and more time actually present in his own home, occasionally sharing coffee with Grace in the mornings before the household woke, conversations that had slowly, naturally evolved from professional courtesy into genuine friendship. Neither of them rushed to define what it was becoming. Both had learned, in their own painful ways, that the best things in life rarely need to be forced. Vanessa's name eventually faded from Boston's social circles entirely, her carefully built reputation unable to survive the quiet truth that had finally caught up with her. She moved to another city, started over under circumstances Nathan never bothered to track, and became, for the Cole household, simply a difficult chapter that had ultimately taught everyone involved something valuable about the difference between charm and character. On a quiet evening nearly 14 months after that fateful dinner party, Eleanor sat on the back porch with Grace, watching Emma chase fireflies across the lawn while Nathan grilled dinner nearby, an image so ordinary and warm that it hardly resembled the tense, glittering world the estate had once represented. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked quietly, standing up to her that night. "It cost you so much, at least for a little while." Grace considered the question seriously before answering. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "How different things could have gone if I'd just stayed quiet like I always had before. But then I think about Emma, and what kind of mother I want to be for her. I don't want her growing up thinking dignity is something you trade away for a paycheck. Some things are worth more than the fear of losing everything." Eleanor smiled, watching Emma's laughter carry across the lawn in the fading evening light. "That," she said, "is exactly the lesson this family needed to learn. Sometimes it takes someone with far less power than everyone else in the room to remind the rest of us what real strength actually looks like." That, in the end, is the heart of this story. Money can buy comfort, status, even the appearance of love, but it can never buy dignity, courage, or the quiet strength of a person who refuses to be treated as less than they are, no matter how much they have to lose. Grace never set out to be a hero. She simply refused to let cruelty win in a moment when everyone else in that room had already decided it was safer to look away. If this story moved you even a little, if it reminded you that kindness and courage still matter in a world that often rewards neither, do me a favor, hit that like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that their dignity is worth more than any paycheck, send this one their way. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.